All right, so this is probably the big one, the one you've been looking forward to. We're talking about hazardous waste today in our lesson on waste in my unit for my environmental science class. So we're talking a little bit about what hazardous waste is, some of the legislation here in the US that governs hazardous waste, and we're going to talk about how it's disposed. We're going to keep this simple at a high school level. I may link to some more videos or host them in the playlist to expound on this. We're definitely going to talk more about it in my own classroom. So hazardous wastes are, let's make sure we have a definition for it. Any material that can be harmful to human health or the environment if not properly disposed of. Right? Take that with a grain of salt because even if it's properly disposed of, it might still be harmful to the environment. We may just be making sure it isn't a problem anymore. Right? The picture down at the bottom of this slide has a lot of municipal examples of hazardous waste. Just like we had municipal solid waste and industrial solid waste, we have municipal hazardous waste and industrial hazardous waste. Right? I know that personally I have most of these things in my home, right? I have some gasoline in my garage for my lawnmower. I've got some WD-40. I've got weed killer, right? I've got some extra paint for my house. I've got all these things, right? And you might have some of them too. For my classroom, I'm going to be asking you to name some of these objects of municipal solid waste or examples of solid waste, at least for a test. These are some great examples. All right, moving on to legislation, we have the RCRA and the Superfund Act. With my class, I don't require you to know the years, but please know that the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act came before the Superfund Act. And the problems with the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act led to the Superfund Act. So the RCRA said that producers, anyone that makes hazardous waste, needs to keep records of it, how it was handled, and where it was disposed of. Note that that doesn't include how it was taken care of, just how it was disposed of. So much of the time, companies would sell it from one company to another to take care of it. And then the company that produced it would have records that they handled it well, that they disposed of it with company XYZ. It's XYZ's problem now and not the originator's problem, right? The Superfund Act, which was passed in 1980, said that any owner of a hazmat disposal location, so a company that disposes of hazardous waste, is responsible for that hazardous waste. They need to properly dispose of it and clean it up. So it gave the EPA some teeth to really enforce that. They can sue them. They can come for their wallets, right? They can take money out of their pockets, and that led to a bunch of cleanup. However, there's still a lot of Superfund sites out there. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has a website that you can go look up Superfund sites around where you live based on your zip code. I highly suggest you do that. Some of these are government owned, some of them are privately owned, but you can find information about the specific ones around you pretty easily. I also want to talk about the NFPA rating guide here, all right? This is something you've probably seen. Multicolored diamonds on the side of semi-trucks or on the side of containers. Here in my classroom, I've got these on every single chemical in my lab, right? So I'm going to ask my class to know that big numbers are bad, right? They're more dangerous, and what each color represents. If you want to take notes on this, pause the video here. We're going to talk more about this in classroom when we do some exercises with this, but know that blue is for health, right? So any problem to the body from ingesting, from being exposed to it, from inhaling it, anything like that, all right? 4, you're going to die. It's not good. You do not want to be handling 4s without very, very specific personal protective equipment. Red means flammability. So how likely is it to catch fire, right? 0s are good because they're not going to burn. But a lot of things will burn if exposed to the right circumstances. So many times we see 1s and 2s. Sometimes we'll see 3s. Alcohols are usually 2s or 3s here, all right? Very rarely do we see 4s. Instability hazard talks about the chemical itself, how likely it is to break down, how likely it is to react with things. Um, and so, or like if it's under pressure, atmospheric pressure or a vacuum, that kind of thing, what happens? White is sometimes called special hazard, sometimes it's called specialty, sometimes it's called specific hazards. For my class, again, I don't care which one we use. The NFPA calls it a special hazard. So these are specific things that are called out because they can be big problems, right? So the W with a line through it, a strike through, means that if it's exposed to water, it's going to react violently. It's going to explode. It's going to blow up, right? It can catch fire. An SA means it's an asphyxiant. That means it displaces the oxygen in the area. It's heavier than oxygen usually. Or it can bind to parts of your lungs and make it so that you can't breathe. These are bad. Get away from these if they're spilled. Make sure that somebody that is wearing proper protective equipment and is licensed to handle this is handling this. OX is oxidizing, which means it can cause problems for metals. It also can cause problems for skin, for you. So it's usually accompanied by high blue and high yellow numbers. Again, for my class, I'm specifically asking you to know that higher numbers are bad and what each of these colors represent. Right. With hazardous waste, managing it is easiest by preventing it. Right. So changing production methods to produce less hazardous waste or eliminating hazardous waste from the through line is much easier. So more money gets put into that. We can also treat some hazardous waste to turn it into non-hazardous materials or just industrial solid waste, right? Or non-solid if it's a liquid. So if it's an acid, if it's very, very acidic, we can treat it with a base to make it less acidic. If it's very, very alkaline or basic, we can treat it with an acid to make it more neutral, right? To turn it into something called a buffer solution that's safer to use. We may be able to use a bacteria or enzyme that breaks it down. Again, just like we talked about with plastics, bioengineering here and actually breeding bacteria that can break down hazardous materials is a thing that is being researched right now. Hopefully, within my kid's lifetime, that'll be doable and we can safely dispose of some hazardous materials that we cannot dispose of safely right now. We've also seen that plants can absorb heavy metals from soils and remove it kind of in a more natural way. It does take longer, but it can turn soil that has been contaminated into less contaminated soil, safer to be around. Right. Long-term storage is an option. We also have short-term solutions. So short-term means we're incinerating it. So we have to have specially designed filters and specially designed incinerators that use a lot of energy and create highly, highly toxic, highly hazardous filters at the end point that then have to be disposed of properly. Or, again, just like with solid waste, it could be exported. Exporting it to another country means that it's someone else's problem. Right? Some places, this is illegal. Some places, it's not. Right? But if you're exporting it, even if it's just out of a city or out of a more residential area where people live into an uninhabitable location, that is safer, right? Some places for waste disposal are inside deserts where nobody lives, because if there's a problem there, it is less likely to affect residents, humans, right? Like I said, sometimes disposal isn't a solution, more of a putting off of the problem. Right? So deep well injection and surface impoundment are the two things that I want my students to know of, and these are more common. It's also relatively safe because it isolates the hazardous waste and keeps it from either impacting groundwater or impacting soil or impacting air, right? Because once it's in the atmosphere, it's in the atmosphere. It's very hard to get rid of. So deep well injection, we take a liquid hazardous waste, we drill down into the ground way deeper than the groundwater is, so below any aquifers, and we are going to pump it in. Sometimes a plastic liner is there, sometimes it's drilling into concrete that's been put in place. Right? Deep well injection is a long-term storage solution that makes it someone else's problem way, way, way down the line, and it may be removing it permanently from human interaction. Surface impoundment is for solids that we can store in a sealed container underwater, right? The water makes that sealed container airtight as well because no air can get it to it. It's also usually kept in an artificial lake, so it's got a sealed bottom. It's effectively a sanitary landfill, but instead of just waste being put in there, storage containers are being put in there. And these aren't the storage containers you see on the back of a semi truck driving down the highway, right? These are specially designed containers, and they're usually designed specifically for whatever they are disposing of. They're not as general purpose as like a trash bag. I missed one. Right, so just looping back to our household hazardous wastes, right? Easy examples: motor oil, paint, batteries. You probably have some electronics and batteries in your pocket right now, right? With our handy dandy cell phones. If you've got any cleaning solution or fertilizers, those are hazardous wastes. Don't be a terrible human being. Don't pour it down the drain. Don't throw it in the trash. Most companies have some kind of facility that will take the hazardous waste off your hand for free. Here in Columbus, Ohio, SWACO has at least 3 locations you can drop off residential or household hazardous waste for free. They'll take it off your hands instead of you putting it in the trash can and then them having to find it and sort it out later, or it make it into a landfill and it'd be a bigger problem. So today we've talked about classifying objects as hazardous waste. We've talked about some of the legislation that's been passed to govern the hazardous waste and some ways in which hazardous waste are disposed. Again, remember, this is not an inclusive resource. This is just a simple high school level understanding that I want my students in my classroom to understand. We're going to be expounding on that in classroom with exercises and activities, but I hope that this helps you in some way, shape, or form. Have a good one.